The hearing will come to order. As a first order of business, I want to welcome Senator John Cornyn from the great state of Texas, a border state like my own, to this caucus. Senator Cornyn is replacing Senator Sessions. And John, we very much welcome you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad that not just border state members like those from Iowa are allowed to be members too, but thank you for letting me join you.
Yeah, thank you. As a first matter of business, today we are releasing a report which looks like this, and I've asked that 25 copies be made available to press as well as members in the audience that might want to look at it. The report is entitled U.S. and Mexican Responses to Mexican Drug Trafficking Organizations, and it's endorsed by all 7 members of the caucus, so it's a bipartisan report. In particular, I want to thank my co-chairman, Senator Grassley, for his efforts on this report. And as you will see, there are a number of recommendations on money laundering, specifically something called stored value, which we had a hearing on. We wrote to the Treasury Department. We had a response from Mr. Levy. They said they were going to take it seriously because we take it seriously. And we believe that thousands of dollars on prepaid cards are simply not declared at the border, and that this becomes a method of sending drug money back and forth. So we'd like to take a good look at it. We talk about the Meredith Initiative. We talk about justice reform. We talk about southbound inspections. And we talk about border tunnels. We talk about cross-border kidnappings. And so I think anybody that would like to look at this report, or you can call the Drug Caucus, and we'll send you a copy of the report. So, Senator Grassley, do you have any comments on the report?
Yes,
Okay.
First of all, I want to thank you for our being able to come together in a bipartisan manner and assemble a list of recommendations that we believe will help both our own country as well as Mexico deal more effectively with the threat of the drug trafficking organizations. In the last few years, we've seen a stunning increase in violence, particularly in Mexico. The drug trafficking organizations have unleashed a violent battle for control of the lucrative trafficking routes across Mexico. We all know that the drug trade has long been associated with violence, but the recent escalation has been unprecedented. It is our hope that some of the ideas and recommendations contained in this report will help Congress and the federal government implement policies that will assist our Mexican neighbors. However, we in the United States cannot go it alone. We also need the full cooperation and partnership of the government of Mexico, just as we need to secure our southwestern borders from incoming illegal drugs. Mexico must do its part to secure the northern border from illicit proceeds and other contrabands like firearms. More work remains to be done on this topic, and we will be working on additional reports to address the specific questions about the causes and sources of illegal firearms in Mexico in the near future. And while we may not agree on the causes and sources of illegal firearms in Mexico, and will likely be issuing separate reports on that subject, it should not take away from the good work and recommendations set forth here in this report. Combating violence by drug trafficking organizations will require cooperation not only in a bipartisan manner here in our country, but also along both sides of the border. I'm glad that we were able to work together on this report and secure support of all members of this caucus. This is truly a bipartisan product that we hope will be informative to other members and provide some options going forward to help stop the drug trade and the violence associated with it. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I would like also to thank the staff who put in a great deal of work. 3 people on the Democratic side, Eric Jacobstein, who is the director of this Drug Caucus unit, Renee Hanna, and also Kevin Hartman. Kevin Hartman has been detailed from the DEA to us, and he's been just great and very helpful with the report we did on Afghanistan and now Mexico. So they've done a lot of work, and I'm very grateful. I know, you want to introduce the staff on your side that had something to do with it, or?
No, not at this point.
Okay. Now let's move on. We are here today to explore ways for the United States to help combat rising violence in Central America. One of the main reasons for the unprecedented rise of violence in Central America is the arrival of two of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking organizations, Los Zetas and the Sinaloa Cartel. Los Zetas is made up of former Mexican military members. The Sinaloa Cartel, headed by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, is considered the most powerful drug trafficking organization in Mexico. Central America's location between the world's largest producers of illicit drugs in South America and the world's largest drug-consuming nation in the United States makes it particularly vulnerable to drug traffickers. As the Mexican government cracks down on drug trafficking organizations, traffickers are breaking drug shipments into smaller loads, passing it through Central America before making their way to Mexico and up to the United States. According to the Congressional Research Service, 95% of cocaine entering the United States flows through Mexico or its territorial waters, with 60% of that cocaine having first transited through Central America. It is a big deal. We have a map here, and you can see that Central America has become not only one of the most violent places, but also you can see through the points, all the points of entry. Those are all points of entry where drugs have actually been brought in to Central America. Contrary to what many people might think, the murder rates in Central America last year were significantly higher than those in Mexico. In 2010, there were 18 homicides per 100,000 people in Mexico. In comparison, there were 50 murders per 100,000 people in Guatemala, 66 in El Salvador, and 77 in Honduras. Now, violence in Central America is not limited to drug trafficking. Transnational youth gang members in Central America number around 70,000 and are particularly active in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Other illegal criminal networks are active throughout Central America and are sometimes closely linked to elites, including current and former military and government officials. The United States is supporting our neighbors in Central America as they try to combat crime and violence through the Central America Regional Security Initiative. Since 2008, Congress has appropriated $260 million in security assistance to Central America. This assistance ranges from the transfer and maintenance of boats and helicopters to police and justice training and institution building. Now, budgets in Washington are tight these days, and we have to make the most we can of the money we spend, particularly our foreign assistance. In Central America, I hope we can continue to expand the creation of sensitive investigative units, which are highly trained and vetted units that work with host country counterparts. This has been a very successful model in Mexico, we have found, and also Colombia, and must be expanded throughout Central America. Of course, enforcement alone will not be enough. Countries in Central America suffer from a cycle of impunity that will not end until citizens know that their country's justice systems will deliver real results. Guatemala, a country with a 98% impunity rate, has been working with the United Nations since 2008, when it created the international community against impunity in Guatemala. This United Nations This United Nations Commission, known as CSIG, has helped to dismantle violent criminal organizations by co-leading investigations with the Guatemalan Attorney General's office. For example, in 2010, 14 Zetas leaders in Guatemala were convicted as a result of a CSIG investigation. The CSIG is precisely the kind of model that should be replicated in other Central American countries. So I hope that today's hearing is just the beginning of a conversation of how the United States can support Central America in reducing its dangerous level of violence, its trafficking of drugs. You know, it's all part of a chain, and we're at one end of that chain. And the drugs, let's say they come from Colombia or elsewhere, and they go by fast boat, and they come in to Central America, and they go by truck. And you will even see in this report submarines that are used to transport these drugs. And they come in through various harbors, and they drift up through Mexico, and then right into the good old US of A. And the time has really come to do something about it. So with that, let me turn, would you like to make some comments?
Yeah,
and then I'll introduce the witnesses.
Yeah. I thank you for holding this hearing because drug-related violence in Central America is an important topic threatening our national security. I continue to be concerned about the rising violence caused by criminal organizations in both Mexico and Central America, and I want to better understand the situation so that we can help those countries strengthen their efforts. During prior hearings held by the Drug Caucus and also by the Judiciary Committee that each of us senators serve on, I've heard from experts that drug cartels and other criminal organizations referred to as drug trafficking organizations make billions moving illegal narcotics. These organizations use unsecured areas throughout Central America and Mexico to establish lucrative trafficking routes. They also further destabilize weak governments and terrorize vulnerable citizens. The UN Office of Drugs and Crimes estimate that 200 metric tons of cocaine come through Central America and Mexico before coming here. The profit of these narco traffickers is estimated upwards of $6 billion annually. As a result, these drug trafficking organizations are obviously well funded. They will also go to any lengths to protect their very lucrative business, including corruption of government officials and mass murders. These criminal organizations are very adept at shifting their operations and trafficking routes to paths of least resistance. As Mexican government and our government have found out, as we've tried to crack down on drug traffickers operating within its borders, they have increased their presence further south in countries of Central America. According to the New York Times, 84% of the known cocaine shipments moving north to our country crossed Central America in 2010, compared to only 44% in 2008. These countries are very attractive to criminal organizations because they're already weak by high unemployment, high crime rates, and endemic government corruption. The porous borders between Guatemala and southern Mexico is extremely vulnerable right now. The border is 6 miles in length and has only 8 official checkpoints, with a very weak and non-existent governmental presence to halt the traffickers. Criminal organizations move freely and throughout the entire region from Central America to Mexico with little concern of anybody to stop. At a recent Armed Services Committee hearing, General Frazier, commander of U.S. Southern Command, stated, quote, "The northern triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras is the deadliest zone in the world outside of active war zones," end of quote. Las Zetas drug trafficking organization is considered the most violent criminal organization operating in Central America. The Zetas are a paramilitary criminal organization formed over a decade ago when members of the Mexican Elite Special Operations Unit deserted and became an armed wing of the Gulf drug cartel. According to media reports, the Zetas have been linked to rising violence in Central America as they battle local gangs for control of territory. They are also simply limiting their operations, or they're not simply limiting their operations to moving narcotics. We have an example written in April stating that when Guatemalan police raided an alleged warehouse of the organization in April 2009, they found nearly, quote, 600 grenades, 11 machine guns, and 5,000 rounds of ammunition stored in boxes labeled, quote, Guatemalan military industry, end of quote. The article also states that these weapons were obtained from Guatemalan military based in sales or theft. Aside from these issues, perhaps the biggest obstacle to tackling drug trafficking is in the region of the current fiscal situation. Central American governments cannot afford many large-scale efforts to combat the cartels. So we have a situation where money's a problem, and we have to deal with that as well. I did not go through my entire statement, and I would ask that the entire statement be put in the record in place of my verbalizing it. Thank you very much.
So ordered, and thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman. Senator Coburn, do you have something you'd like to say at this time?
I know you know the difference between me and Senator Coburn.
Could I do
Senator
something?
Feinstein.
Senator Cornyn.
It happens frequently.
Could I do something?
Yes, sir.
I wanted to honor my people that worked on this report. We have Nick Podez. It's Nick P. You can't pronounce these last names, so I'm not going to. Janet Drew and David Blake were very
Thank you.
Much involved in this
you.
effort.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll put the full name in the record.
Okay.
Madam Chairman, if you will allow me just to put my full statement in the record and just offer a brief one paragraph or two. Obviously, being from Texas and well acquainted with the border region in my state, about 1,200 miles of border with Mexico, I know a lot of the focus has been on Mexico and the violence there, but and I'm glad the Drug Caucus has now expanded its view to what's happening south of Mexico, because as you and the ranking member point out, it's very significant in terms of the level of violence. I would point out that the Northern Triangle of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador has a per capita GDP of about $2,700, which is less than a third of that in Mexico. And obviously the weak economy, together with the huge amounts of money that can be obtained by drug trafficking, makes that a difficult challenge for them and for us. But finally, I would say that the cartels, it strikes me as these are now sometimes called transnational criminal organizations, which I think is a good way to view them, because they're more than just drug cartels. These are organizations that traffic in people, drugs, weapons, anything that will make money. And they're not particularly discriminating except by as far as how much money they can make. And the nature of the impunity that you mentioned and that Senator Grassley alluded to, together with the virtual pipeline we see coming from South America through Central America and through Mexico and the United States for illegal immigration, which yielded about 59,000 people from countries other than Mexico detained on our southern border just last year, represents an obvious national security threat to the United States. So I know you know all those things, as does Senator Grassley, but I just wanted to say that I think our focus, while here, is on illegal drugs, that it is the threat imposed by these transnational criminal organizations is even broader than that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and you're absolutely correct. As a matter of fact, President Calderon, when we spoke with him while he was here, made that point, that they have evolved into something that probably is one of the most serious organized crime organizations ever seen to man. Totally vicious, and it's really a huge problem. And, you know, my heart went out to Calderon because I have the greatest respect for what he has tried to do, and it's just very, very hard. Well, let me go on and welcome our distinguished witnesses today. Thomas Harrigan is Chief of Operations for the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. He's responsible for leading the worldwide drug enforcement operations of the agency's 227 domestic and 87 foreign offices, as well as the Special Operations Division, the Aviation Division, and the Office of Diversion Control. He was appointed to this position in 2008 and is a principal advisor to the DEA administrator on all enforcement-related matters. On February 16th, President Obama nominated Mr. Harrigan to be the DEA's Deputy Administrator. We also have Roberta Jacobson, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs and Hemispheric Security Coordinator at the State Department, where she oversees security assistance for Central America, Mexico, and the Andean region and the Caribbean. Prior to this, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Canada, Mexico, and North American Free Trade Agreement issues. She has also served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the United States Embassy in Lima, Peru, and as Director of the Office of Policy Planning and Coordination in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. So we welcome both of you, and Mr. Harrigan, why don't we begin with you? If you could we would really like to have a conversation with you. So rather than reading prepared remarks, you can do what you want, of course, but if you could summarize them, that would be most helpful.
Absolutely. Again, I thank you very much, Chairman, Co-Chairman Grassley, Senator Cornyn, for allowing me to testify here today. And what I'll do is I'll set aside my oral remarks and tell you basically the position that DEA views the problems that you so well articulated in each of your opening statements. As far as DEA, we look at the southwest border, to us, starts in Colombia. And that's how we target these organizations. What we do is we work and we target, as you well know, the command and control nodes of these organizations, primarily the Mexican and Colombian organizations, which impact the United States so significantly. Over the past several years, we have seen this movement, and again, Chairman Feinstein, as you had mentioned, the courageous work of the government of Mexico, President Calderon, the SSP, the Mexican Federal Police, the Attorney General's Office, the PGR, and the new Attorney General, Maricela Morales. The work that they've done has been nothing short, I think, of incredible. And what's happening, we have the work that's being done in Colombia with our very good partners, our very good friends, primarily the Colombian National Police, General Naranjo. And what they're doing is, due to the efforts, the increased enforcement efforts of the Colombians, pushing these cartels, if you will, northward, and the Mexicans pushing them southward, we have seen, as you had mentioned earlier, cartels such as the Zetas, the Sinaloa, and certain remnants of the Gulf Cartel as well, operating in some of the countries with relative impunity. And what DEA has done in very close partnership with our friends, the Department of State, and the interagency as a whole, to include the Department of Defense, and more importantly, our host country counterparts, which I think is key. Again, we need to extend that rule of law and bring the professionalism and expertise to our counterparts, much as we've done over the years in Colombia and Mexico to our counterparts in Central America. And as I mentioned before, I saw Senator Cornyn laughing, smiling when I had mentioned the southwest border for us starts in Colombia. We have an initiative called the Drug Flow Attack Strategy, which is a very innovative approach where, again, we bring the interagency together, and we realize we're in very tight budget times. And based upon intelligence that we've developed, that the Mexicans and Colombians have developed, and more importantly, our counterparts in Central America, we produce operational packages and targeting packages using resources from DOD, GAD South primarily, and place assets in very strategic places throughout, whether it's the Western Caribbean, whether it's the Eastern Caribbean, or whether it's in the landmass of Central America. And we use this very, I believe, very innovative approach in where everything we do is intel-driven. So we've gone basically from playing checkers to playing chess now. I believe we are, although the cartels always adapt, and as Co-Chairman Grassley said, they typically take the path of least resistance. That's certainly the case. We are able, utilizing this drug flow attack strategy, again, being intel-driven, we have been able to place assets in very strategic places throughout South America, Central America, and obviously Mexico. So we have been, I believe, very successful in doing that, and we've seen, based upon recent seizures, recent arrests, not only in Colombia and Mexico, but in Central America as well. One of the goals, and I'll be very quick, Chairman, and you had mentioned, are these SIUs, the Sensitive Investigative Units. From DEA's viewpoint, they are our bread and butter in our overseas locales. Again, DEA has the largest U.S. federal law enforcement presence overseas, and we're in each of the 7 Central American countries, obviously, in addition to Mexico and Colombia as well. And these SIUs work the most complex, sophisticated, sensitive criminal investigations that we have. And the importance of these SIUs, again, will we ever eliminate corruption? No, but we could certainly minimize it. And the training, the selection process, the vetting that these SIUs go through are, in my opinion, second to none. And it gives us an incredible leg up, I believe, against the cartels because, again, we're not only able to work very sensitive, complex investigations, but we also develop these units in Central America, these counter-narcotic units, to a place where I believe they will, and they are, several of them are very professional. They've established and formed certain expertise in their field. But again, as we continue to work with these SIUs and vetted units, there is no doubt in my mind that we will have significant impact against the cartels. Again, that is my truncated version, Chairman, of my oral remarks. I will be obviously happy to respond to any questions you and the other senators may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harrigan. Mrs. Jacobson?
Thank you, Chairman Feinstein, Co-Chairman Grassley, and Senator Cornyn. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for the work of the caucus, which has consistently, I think, shone a light on issues that we think, certainly Tom Harrigan and myself think, are among the most important in the hemisphere. To just kind of reprise my statement briefly, let me talk about a couple of things that I think are really at the heart of our Central American strategy and what we're trying to do in that region. As you know, the Obama administration has 4 primary citizen security initiatives in the Western Hemisphere, and they are the Colombia Strategic Development Initiative, the Central American Regional Security Strategy, the Merida Initiative in Mexico, and the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. In our minds, none of them can really work fully unless all of them are working. And your map is a perfect example of the way in which Central America gets squeezed when there are effective operations and efforts made elsewhere. Secretary Clinton has listened to the leaders in Central America for the last year or two who have increasingly said that the citizen security issue is their highest priority. We know that the levels of violence are far too high. But we also see that after the civil conflicts of the 1980s, there has been an underinvestment in security forces, in law enforcement, and in rule of law institutions. And so one of the things we think is crucial is ensuring both that we are present and able to support those institutions and help them build capacity, but also that host governments in Central America contribute to the rebuilding of those institutions and ensuring that any programs we undertake are sustainable over the medium and long term. In addition, of course, we make sure that we're engaging with the countries of Central America as partners. When President Obama was in Central America, in El Salvador, in March of this year, he talked about and launched the Central American Citizen Security Partnership, and that really means shared responsibility, both of us doing our part to try and improve the situation on the ground, create safer streets, and work to strengthen institutions throughout the hemisphere. As many of you have noted, the northern three countries, the northern triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, are really our primary focus. We have redoubled our efforts in those areas and looked at our programs carefully. In places like Belize, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama, we feel that we will continue to engage with all of those countries, but it may be at a different level and more a question of rebuilding institutions. We also think, and I think Tom Harrigan has mentioned this, that the contribution of partners from the region, in particular Colombia and Mexico, is crucial. But we think there are other regional partners and those outside the region who can contribute as well. Canada has a great deal to offer in this regard. Chile has created a world-class police force, and we're working extensively with the European Union, with the Inter-American Development Bank, and others. None of us feel that we can do this alone, but all of us together feel like we can make a real difference. All of us are working towards a very important meeting coming up at the end of June in Guatemala. The Central American Integration Organization, or CICA, will hold an international conference of support on security issues. And we think that at that meeting there will be a great deal done to bring the international community together with real commitments by the host governments to begin to make sustainable changes in the trends in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I may begin with you, Mr. Harrigan. First of all, I think you've done very good work in Afghanistan, particularly in the southern section, and I want to say thank you very much, and we've all tried to be of help, and we will continue to try to be of help. I think the DEA has really done a great job.
Well, Chairman, I have to, if you will allow me, thank you and the Senate Drug Caucus for the unwavering support you have demonstrated and provided to DEA, especially in Afghanistan, and we truly appreciate your efforts as well.
Thank you, and I gather to date, how many from Afghanistan, how many major drug dealers have you arrested and brought to the United States for trial?
Well, we've had several right now, as you very well know, Chairman. We have not extradited anyone out of Afghanistan over the last several years. We were able, several years ago, we had several high-value targets, very significant drug traffickers, Haji Juma Khan, Haji Batsko, Haji Basir Nourzai, Haji Baz Mohammed. But as of late, as far as extradition, that is something that is an ongoing discussion with our government and with the government of Afghanistan.
Well, that's news to me, because I thought that there is legislation, if there's a nexus to terrorism, that the DEA could come in, pick up a drug trafficker, and bring them to the United States for trial.
Again, ma'am, as it pertains to extraditions, that is something we obviously need the government of Afghanistan to approve as well, and they look at it really on a case-by-case basis. We have not. We have lured individuals in the past out of Afghanistan. There was an extradition several years ago that was approved by the government of Afghanistan. But as far as a quote-unquote an extradition, that has not taken place within the last few years.
Well, perhaps I'm aware of the facts of one case. Maybe I'll talk with you about that separately then. I mean, I believe that extradition is such a critical tool. And on page 28 of the report that we have just put out, it points out the number of extraditions from Mexico. And it's my understanding that 37 drug traffickers have been extradited to the United States from Central America over the past 3 years. with the overwhelming majority coming from Panama, with 21 extraditions, and Costa Rica with 12. How committed are the governments of Central America to extraditing drug traffickers? And then, are you saying that the government of Afghanistan will not agree to extradite major drug traffickers?
Well, not exactly, ma'am. Again, it's done on a case-by-case basis. It is those traffickers that are significant enough that we charge, and I believe you were alluding to the Patriot Act, 960A, which allows us to charge these traffickers without the nexus, particularly of the drugs to the United States, in the United States. And again, it is broached. It has been broached with the government of Afghanistan. And again, it's looked at on a case-by-case basis. And I know there's ongoing dialogue as we identify those traffickers, which we believe should be extradited to the United States. We obviously engage with our counterparts in State Department, at the embassy in Kabul as well, and obviously with the government of Afghanistan.
Do you make a finding that the money goes to the Taliban?
We have
their activities?
Yes, we have seen without question some of the drug revenue is used by the Taliban for their insurgent activities. We have, over the last several years, as you very well know, Chairman, we have been able to demonstrate that nexus between the drug traffickers and the terrorists. And if you think even in the Western Hemisphere years ago with the FARC, when the FARC began, 15, 20 years ago, when the government of Colombia basically ceded a third of Colombia to the FARC, they were in the drug trade primarily acting as facilitators. Now, as you know, they are nothing but primarily a drug trafficking organization. We've seen the same with the Taliban, where they were initially facilitators, provided protection, transportation. Now they are involved in drug trafficking in a major way.
I think this testimony is very significant because there has been, some have said, well, it's really de minimis. It really doesn't matter. It matters a great deal. And this money is, in effect, fueling the Taliban to make attacks against our people and innocent Afghanis. And I think this has to be known, and we have to be supportive of your activity in that regard. No good is going to come from it, that's for sure. Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thank you very much. I'm going to start out with you, Mr. Jacobson, if I could. In the last couple of years, there's been a number of news stories about firearms being intercepted at Mexico's southern border that are being smuggled out of Central America. What is most concerning is that these firearms include high-powered military-grade weapons such as grenades and rocket launchers. These articles highlight how these weapons that were confiscated included identifiers that show they were either stolen or purchased from Central American militaries. Is there any estimate, two questions, is there any estimate of how many weapons have been lost by Central American militaries that may now be in the hands of Mexican or Central American drug trafficking organizations? And secondly, what has the State Department done to engage the governments of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador about protecting weapons on military bases? If you can answer those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. On the first question, in terms of an estimate of numbers of weapons lost, I'm afraid I don't have a figure for you. I'll see if we have anything more precise, but I suspect we don't have.
Submit it in writing.
Absolutely. And we'll obviously talk with our colleagues in ATF because that's a big part of what we're doing in Central America is working on weapons issues. But the other thing that the State Department is doing and has been doing for a number of years with Central American countries, including the ones that you mentioned, is working with them much more closely on technical assistance and training and advising on what's called stockpile management and other protections that can be taken to keep the weapons on military bases, in police precincts, weapons that are held by security forces, accounted for, and secure. And so this is a big part of our efforts in the hemisphere, and certainly a big part of our efforts in Central America are stockpile and weapons management, identification of weapons, and the ability to reduce the number of weapons that may be illegally trafficked and fall into the hands of criminal organizations.
And for both you and Mr. Harrigan, I want to talk about the role Venezuela is playing in the drug trade through Central America. That concerns me very much. Venezuela is a transit country where narcotics are shipped to Central America. On May the 9th, 2011, Walid Maclay, trafficking kingpin from Venezuela, was arrested in Colombia and extradited back to Venezuela. I'm concerned about this extradition because he publicly stated that he was willing to provide critical information on Venezuela generals and political figures that support drug trafficking in the United States. The United States did file extradition requests with Colombia, but he was ultimately sent back to Venezuela. In failing to secure the extradition, we may have lost a vital source of information about combating the drug trade. Last month, I requested a staff briefing from both DEA and State Department. My staff was briefed by DEA, but we never heard back from the State Department. So, Ms. Jacobson, I would want my staff to have a full briefing by the State Department regarding the efforts made to secure the extradition of Mr. Maclay, and could you give me a date when that briefing could be held?
Senator, thank you. I can't give you a precise date. I certainly can commit to you that your staff will get briefed by State, and I regret that lack of response. I really do.
That's okay.
Because we will definitely set that up right away. Two things.
If you want to go ahead, and then I've got a follow-up.
Okay, thank you. First, on the role of Venezuela in narcotics trafficking, certainly my colleague can speak more directly to that issue because most of our information on that comes from our colleagues in the DEA and elsewhere. But it is something that we are concerned about. There is clear evidence of trafficking patterns increasing through and from Venezuela, and frankly, we remain interested in engaging with the Venezuelan government, if possible, on that issue, but that has not been productive to date. On the issue of Walid Maclay, what I would say, and again, I think my colleague probably has the definitive answer on this, is that we thought it very important that U.S. law enforcement agencies be able to obtain as much information as possible in the case of Mr. Maclay, and we are confident that they were able to have a considerable amount of access to Mr. Maclay before he was extradited.
Okay, so then you're saying the fact he was extradited does not preclude us from having the information we think we would have got if he had not been extradited.
It's a hypothetical to say that we might or might not have gotten additional information from him if he had been extradited, because obviously he did return to Venezuela, but we were able, our law enforcement officials were able to interview Mr. Maclay.
Okay, can either of you tell us maybe why we weren't able to secure the extradition?
Well, again, Co-Chairman Grassley, I certainly don't want to speculate on behalf of the government of Colombia, but again, we filed an extradition request, as you well know. The decision was made by President Santos to extradite Maclay to Venezuela. That was a decision made by the government of Colombia. We filed the extradition request, as you know. We certainly wanted him as well, but again, decision was made by President Santos.
We have had some cooperation from Colombia recently on extradition, haven't we?
Yes, without question.
Let me ask one last question then, and then there will be some that I'll submit for answers in writing. There's more and more escalating violence in Central America as a result of cartels fighting each other over territory and control of this would be for you, Mr. Harrigan, for control of drug trade routes and the tough stand that Mexican President Calderon has taken against cartels in his country. How has the increased violence at the Northern Triangle region affected agency staff's ability to do their job, and are the agents assigned to that area requesting additional training and/or assets to deal with the threats that they're encountering?
Well, obviously, it is a very real threat, and I think that's the sort of the focus of today's hearing. DEA has a presence in each of the Central American countries. We've been in most of them for close to 40 years since our existence. We work extremely closely with those counterparts. We have an SIU in Guatemala. We have an SIU in Panama as well. We have vetted units in the rest of the Central American countries, with the exception of Nicaragua. And again, we had an SIU there several years ago, and it was disbanded as a result of a request from the government of Nicaragua. We work very closely with our counterparts, primarily the vetted units and the SIUs. But again, as you alluded to, sir, we see so much of the footprint of the Mexican cartels in Central America now. We work very closely with the Mexicans, primarily SSP and PGR, and the Colombian National Police in targeting these groups. Just last month, we had a meeting in Mexico with Genaro Garcia Luna, who is the head of the Mexican Federal Police, and General Naranjo, the head of the Colombian Police. And what we've agreed to do is we call it a tripartite meeting between the DEA, PGR, and CNP. The decision was made to bring in the Central American countries as well, because we are seeing, the Colombians are seeing, the Mexicans are seeing, everyone is seeing, again, this escalation of violence. And the bottom line is, a safer Central America means a safer Mexico and a safer United States. So again, they recognize, we recognize this increased pressure must continue in Central America. Now, as far as training, sir, I believe the training that we provide to our agents, particularly those overseas. As I mentioned before, we have the largest U.S. federal law enforcement presence overseas, DEA does. The training and the equipment certainly suffices in terms of what our people, our analysts, support personnel, and agents need to do and get the job done in Central America.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, both of you, for answering my questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Cornyn?
Thank you. Mr. Harrigan, you mentioned the GIADF South, Joint Interagency Task Force South, I think in Miami, Key West, as in your opening remarks. And my staff reminds me that the 2010 National Drug Control Strategy widely regarded the GIADF South as the gold standard when it came to transit zone intelligence fusion, information sharing, coordination through different federal government agencies and international partnering. And as you know, in El Paso, we have some very important agencies there, one led by the DEA at EPIC, the El Paso Intelligence Center, as well as we have JTF, Joint Task Force North. Could you contrast what functions or what the operations at GIADF South with what is present at JTF North and EPIC, and to see, I'm basically interested if there are functionalities, if there are things that we could bring to El Paso that would help in that effort there, of course, led by the DEA at EPIC, that would provide you additional resources to fight this important fight.
Certainly. So let me just preface my remarks saying, Senator, that I am not an expert discussing GIADF South or JTF North. However, that being said, just knowing over the last 25 years that I have been with DEA, the close working relationship, what is developed out of GIADF South on the sort of the myriad of databases and intelligence fusion and counterparts from around this hemisphere that sit at GIADF South. They are able to queue assets in a way, as I mentioned before, our drug flow attack strategy, intelligence-driven. We take information from EPIC, the El Paso Intelligence Center, which is integral. And again, EPIC is confined, if you will, it focuses on the southwest border. So we're able to fuse, deconflict, and coordinate the intelligence that is based either out of EPIC with GIADF South We sit down twice a year with Jihad of South and plan out operations throughout Jihad of South's area of responsibility. We are very engaged as well with the Southern Command, General Frazier and the Southern Command as well. But we looked at that very closely, I believe, Senator, as far as any duplication of effort or redundancies. We do not believe it is there. Each has their own unique expertise and set of databases, if you will, that we rely on considerably. And again, as you had mentioned to, alluded to, Jihad of South, I believe as well, is the gold standard. I interact with Admiral Lloyd, the head of Jihad of South, on at least a weekly basis. Unfortunately, as you probably know, he'll be retiring in about 2 weeks. But the relationship that we have with Jihad of South, obviously EPIC being an interagency intel center, but a DEA-led intelligence center, I think as well, in my opinion, is the gold standard. And of course, we work very closely with the military, whether it's Joint Task Force Bravo, whether it's Southcom, whether it's Northcom relative to Mexico. So again, I think they play off one another extremely well. We're able to fuse and collect, deconflict, and coordinate intelligence in a very, very effective manner.
Well, that's very helpful. Of course, the law of the land is that civilian law enforcement takes the lead, and law enforcement, not the military. But I think it's also important that the civilian-led law enforcement agency, and have access to all the resources of the United States government that we may have to be able to help in this fight. So I appreciate your answer. The last thing I wanted to ask you, just to get your observations on, is, you know, we tend to, it seems like, look through a soda straw sometimes, at least that's my impression, at different problems, and we don't as often, at least from this perspective, look at it more broadly and see how they're interrelated. I alluded to that a little bit in my opening statement, in that obviously this is the drug caucus, but I told you my impression that I think the transnational criminal organizations will traffic in anything that makes them money, whether it's people, weapons, or drugs. Could you just explain sort of the range of activities that these organizations are involved in, and any interrelationship that you've observed based on your 25 years of experience?
Yeah, I guess I could say it very succinctly, Senator. Anything that will make the money, that is the bottom line. Obviously, drugs dominates that. The UNODC, I believe, put the figure at illicit drugs were responsible for about $390 billion with a B of illicit revenue that was generated in 2010. Again, anything that will make the money, they are involved in, from weapons trafficking to people trafficking, to weapons of mass destruction, you name it. If there's a way, yeah, if there's a way to make money, they're involved.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's obviously great to have the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence here, because she's and obviously a fellow border state senator, and I appreciate all of your commitment to the fight, and I hope you will let us know if there are resources, authorities you need that you don't have in order to do your job even better. We'll look to you for your advice and counsel on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I meant to do this, and if I may, would it be fair to say that the Zetas and the Sinaloa cartels really dominate in Central America? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
With again, as I mentioned earlier, I believe, there's certain remnants of the Gulf Cartel in Central, but without question, the Zetas and the Sinaloa.
So this is percolated south out of Mexico, down there. Well, what do you see percolating north? Central America, Mexico, United States, with Zetas and Sinaloa. Anything?
Well, again, they've been battling, as you know. The Zetas broke away from the Gulf Cartel several years ago, and there's been fighting. It seems every time, and I know you had put up earlier, Chairman, the copy of the map of Mexico with the spheres of influence, if you will, of the various cartels, and that will never change. there you go. The thing that does change is obviously these cartels influence. They fight, they battle over these very lucrative plazas up along our southwest border. And again, they vie for control of those southwest border because it translates into money and millions, if not billions of dollars as well. So again, as you could see, that is that's a very accurate depiction of the cartels and sort of their spheres of influence, if you will, throughout the country of Mexico.
Do you deal at all with Mexican mafia in this country?
Well, I mean, obviously the cartels. We have seen all 7 cartels operating here throughout the United States. I think the most significant cartel would probably be the Sinaloa cartel. ONDCP, I think, estimated that we see Mexican cartel presence in over 225 cities throughout the United States. So obviously see a major footprint of Mexican cartels scattered throughout the United States, from major cities to small towns.
Do you work with the FBI in that regard?
Yes, we do. We work. I have an outstanding relationship. We do as agency to agency, as we do obviously overseas with Roberta and the folks in the State Department. Hey, we need to look at this, Chairman and Co-Chairman, in a very holistic sort of approach. We're not going to arrest ourselves out of this problem. That's right. And we need to look at it holistically. So what DEA brings to the table, what FBI, what ICE, obviously what State Department in the overseas arena, we need to work in that manner, because if we don't, we're only fooling ourselves.
Well, yeah, I've just become increasingly concerned. You know, California has a major problem with border tunnels, as you know, and the numbers are greatly increased, and they're very sophisticated tunnels. They're deep, they run for quite a distance, some are electrified, they move people illegally, they move mainly drugs, a lot of marijuana, precursor chemicals, and one of the things I've been trying to do, and I know there's a small difference on this committee about it, but is that if you own land on the border, you should be responsible to see that some of your land isn't being used for a border tunnel. We went to Otay Mesa and saw where they took over one brand new warehouse for essentially one room, and you lift up an asphalt tile and there's a huge tunnel underneath it that runs 6 football fields across the border. And that's a major concern to me, because the numbers have increased so dramatically since I first got involved in it.
Yes, I agree. And as you said, the sophistication of some of these tunnels. I know, speaking to my counterparts at DHS, is truly incredible. As you said, some of them, you know, they have electrical feeds, some have tracks. They have oxygen being pumped in, extraordinarily sophisticated.
Well, and the big worry, of course, too, is weapons trafficking. So let me thank you both for being here.
Could I ask one more
Yes,
question?
certainly.
This is Ms. Jacobson. We put $165 million through the Central American Regional Security Initiative and $45 million to date for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. Do you know, for at least for your department, I know the Department of Justice has something to do with it, but for your department, how are your agencies able to ensure that these governments have the capacity to implement these programs? Is there any question about that?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's a great question, and I think it's one of the reasons that, to be quite honest, we started smaller in Central America and, of course, in the Caribbean than we did, for example, in either Colombia or in Mexico, because the ability to absorb funds appropriately and to use them for the purposes that they're meant really wasn't as great as in Mexico or Colombia. So we're comfortable that the funds that have been appropriated, for which we're very grateful, about $260 million total for Central America, are the right amount of funds for the problem in Central America for governments to be able to absorb those funds, for programs to be able to be developed that can work. Obviously, one always says you could use more money, but the fact of the matter is we think this is the right pace, even given the threat that we have. And the other thing I just want to highlight, because I know that Tom has mentioned this a little bit and Chairman Feinstein has alluded to it, is one of the things we're proudest of in all of these programs, but particularly in Central America, where they're not as large, is they are whole-of-government efforts from the U.S. side. State Department money is funding our Justice Department colleagues, our DHS colleagues, Treasury Department colleagues, the right experts for the job. And sometimes that may be State Department, sometimes that may be our colleagues in operational or institution building. USAID is working on prevention strategies. And so we're confident that we can put together something that spans the range of needs in Central America and also demonstrates to those governments the importance of their having whole-of-government solutions.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you both, and thank you very much for your service to our country. It's muchly appreciated. Thank you. And now, our next panel. Somebody change the name cards?
No, I'm going to.
Okay.
Hey, Madam Chairman, I hope it's not rude, but I'm going to have to go
Okay.
back to my office.
All right. Oh, that's too bad. Well,
And I'll submit some questions.
Okay.
for answer in writing. I'm full.
I don't have an introduction for the third witness. Let me move ahead and introduce our second panel. Cynthia Arnson is Director of the Latin America Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Her most recent work has focused on the challenge to democratic governance in Central America, United States-Colombian relations, and efforts to negotiate settlements to internal armed conflict in Latin America. Kevin Casas Zamora is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the former vice president of Costa Rica. He has also served as Costa Rica's Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy. And Ray Walser is a senior policy analyst specializing in Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Walser was a career Foreign Service officer with the State Department for 27 years before joining the Heritage Foundation in 2007. His assignments took him to Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Nicaragua. Ms. Arnson, why don't we begin with you and go right down the line?
Great. Thank you very much, Senator Feinstein. Senator Grassley, thank you for this opportunity to testify. I think we've heard from the previous witnesses and also from your opening statements a great deal of the diagnostics of the problem in Central America, and I'll simply highlight that the recent massacre earlier this month of 27 people in Guatemala in the Petén region, particularly brutal murders, beheadings, has been attributed to the Zetas. There's a possibility that it is a competition for turf between the Zetas and the Sinaloa cartel, but I think it serves to underscore the gravity of the problem and also the way that innocent civilians get caught in this kind of violence. The presence of organized crime has greatly worsened an already alarming crisis of citizen security in Central America. As we know, the 7 countries of the region constitute the most violent areas in the world outside of areas technically at war. The drug trade drives much of this violence. It's not the only driver, but it's the most important. The World Bank recently documented that crime rates are 100 times higher in drug trafficking hotspots, in their word, than in other areas. I'd like to quote some figures from the State Department from the recent INCSR report that show the alarming increase in drug trafficking through Central America. In 2008, the estimate was that 42% of cocaine entering the United States passed through Central America on its way from South America. Scarcely 2 years later, that had jumped to 60% of the total. I think this represents a dramatic shift in trafficking patterns over a 2-year period. Central America, in many ways, was an afterthought to the Merida Initiative, and I think the Obama administration has increasingly recognized the gravity of the problem. But I do think that there is a disconnect between the level of resources that have been committed or proposed and the depth of the problem, and I question whether the amounts that have already been committed, some $260 million starting in FY 2008, with additional $100 million each in FY 10 and or FY 11 and 12, will actually be a game changer in the overall dynamic. I think it's important to remember, just by way of comparison, that during the 12-year war in El Salvador, the United States spent approximately $6 billion over a 12-year period. U.S. assistance to Colombia under Plan Colombia over a similar time frame has been more than $8 billion. And so, I think that there's a real question of scale. I think that the U.S. government is correctly making efforts to respond to regional efforts, as well as the development of national security plans in the region, and these kinds of partnerships should continue. And there's obviously an important emphasis placed on strengthening security institutions. Obviously, we must help address the underlying social conditions and the lack of opportunity that serve as the incubators for social violence. The resources from the United States and from other donor nations and from international financial institutions are essential, but that money can only go so far if elites in the region refuse to pay taxes, and politicians as well as societies are unwilling to increase the rate of taxation as a percentage of GDP. There has been one failure of fiscal reform after another throughout the region. I think it's appropriate that we focus our efforts on the so-called northern tier countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, where the rates of violence are the worst. But I also think it's important to keep in mind Costa Rica, Belize, Nicaragua, where drug trafficking is increasing but has not yet reached the alarming proportions that exist elsewhere in the region. We all know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I think that there is an important need to emphasize prevention and before a situation has gotten out of hand. The framework of shared responsibility between the Obama administration and the countries of Latin America is indeed the correct one, but I do think we need to do more in this country to combat the traffic in arms that go from north to south, to combat money laundering, especially in dollarized economies such as that of El Salvador, and to seize rather than avoid opportunities for a broader debate in this country on demand reduction and anti-drug strategies that have been called for by many in the Congress. I'll conclude by saying that I don't think it's an overstatement to say that crime and violence that are abetted by organized crime in Central America constitute challenges to and threats to democratic governance and the survival of democratic institutions. We must help reinforce not only law enforcement and judicial capacity, but also address the deep poverty, exclusion, and lack of opportunity that provide a vast breeding ground for crime and violence throughout the hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Casas-Zamora, welcome.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'll ask for your indulgence and I'll read my statement. I'm the only non-native speaker, even though I can speak the language.
Certainly, go right ahead.
Thank you very much. Senator Feinstein, Senator Grassley, I feel privileged to testify before this caucus, particularly when the subject matter is of vital importance for the region where I come from. In the expansion of organized crime and the pervasive presence, I feel privileged to testify before this caucus, particularly when the subject matter is of vital importance for the region where I come from, Central America. In the expansion of organized crime and the pervasive presence of criminal violence, Central America is facing an unprecedented challenge, one that risks undoing the region's achievements of the past 2 decades. More than 125,000 Central Americans died in the previous decade alone as a result of crime. As it has been said here, the northern half of Central America is now the most violent region in the world. In 2007, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras had, each of them, more homicides than the 27 countries of the European Union combined. Moreover, in the past decade, homicide rates have gone up in every country in Central America, in some cases dramatically. Central America's crime rates can hardly be understood but in reference to the narcotics maelstrom engulfing the region. Cocaine seizures in Central America have grown 6-fold in the past decade. The penetration of organized crime compounds as much as reflects 2 other structural problems: the marginalization of much of the Central American youth and the weakness of the region's law enforcement institutions. 1/4 of the young in the Isthmus are neither at school nor at work, thus becoming a reserve army for criminal organizations and the region's notorious youth gangs. Law enforcement problems are, if anything, worse. The region's police and judicial institutions are underfunded, under-equipped, and under-trained, as much as they are prone to severe corruption. Unsurprisingly, they command little support from the population. The crux of Central America's crime predicament is easy to identify. Its law enforcement institutions are not merely ineffective to deal with crime. In fact, they compound the problem. In some places in Central America, the firmness of the state's monopoly over legitimate coercion is open to question. At this point, a reference to the situation in Guatemala becomes unavoidable. Guatemala is faced with a growing lawlessness syndrome. The weakness of the state, the pervasive violence, the widespread corruption, and the country's strategic location for drug trafficking are creating a very dangerous cocktail. The United States and the neighboring countries would do well to pay attention and commit resources to help Guatemalans prevent the collapse of their own institutions. The public policy interventions needed to confront Central America's crime plight are complex and expensive. There are many reasons why the United States could and should assist in this endeavor. Indeed, the United States is doing so through the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI, that has been alluded to here. Yet, even the best counter-narcotics assistance program is no substitute for the difficult undertakings that may ultimately deliver Central America from the perils of crime. The Central Americans must accept that just like achieving peace 2 decades ago, providing opportunities for young people and rebuilding their law enforcement institutions is something that only they can do. The United States has a limited capacity to dictate what the future will bring for Central America, but it can help the region's security situation in meaningful ways. 1, scale up resources allocated to CARSI. Since the start of the Merida Initiative in 2008, the funds allotted to the 7 members of CARSI amount to approximately $260 million, less than 1/5 of Mexico's share of U.S. counter-narcotics assistance. This is an indefensible disproportion. It is also a lost opportunity, for CARSI reflects the right priorities for Central America. It will be desirable to avoid spreading CARSI's fund thin in myriad projects. CARSI can only hope to bring about visible changes if it focuses on a few institutional programs that may exert a catalytic effect on the efficacy of law enforcement bodies in the region. Priorities should include: A, improving internal control and anti-corruption units within law enforcement bodies; B, adopting modern information technologies as part of the policy-making process; C, creating vetted units to handle complex multinational investigations; D, improving investigation and prosecutorial capacities with regards to complex financial crimes. However, any decision to scale up U.S. law enforcement cooperation with Central America ought to be made conditional on Central American governments raising a matching sum from domestic sources. And Senator Feinstein, here's a Central American speaking. By all means, don't let the Central American elites who've never paid taxes off the hook on this one. 2, support the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. This UN-sponsored body has proved a valuable resource to carry out investigations that were beyond the capabilities of Guatemala's law enforcement bodies. After 4 years, the Commission can point to real successes, much as its efforts have on occasion been undermined by rulings by the local judiciary. CICIG remains a carefully vetted unit in a country in which the penetration of law enforcement institutions by crime syndicates is rampant. Although the Commission's mandate was extended until 2013, its funding, about $20 million per year, is due to expire in September of 2011. Its demise would be a body blow to a country with few remaining hopes of upholding the rule of law. 3, partner with Mexico and Colombia, a strategy that integrates U.S. efforts against organized crime in Mexico, Colombia, and Central America in a common framework is necessary. Both Mexico and Colombia have developed, in their own right, significant capacities in this struggle, capacities that could help their weaker Central American neighbors. Any U.S. strategy against organized crime in Central America should stimulate cooperation efforts from these two crucial actors in ways that are complementary to the United States' own programs. 4, rethink counter-narcotics policies. If Washington does not want lawlessness to become the fate of its southern neighbors, it is essential to rethink the failed status quo of the so-called war on drugs and have a rational discussion about alternative approaches. This is not coda for legalization of drugs, but rather a passionate call to look at the international evidence in a dispassionate way. The terrifying cost that Central America is bearing in terms of drug-related violence can and should be mitigated by decisions made in Washington. For Washington, paying more attention to Central America would not be a favor or an act of charity. In the case of a region that is showing disturbing signs of political instability, that is a stone's throw away from the United States, and that has already sent 3 million of its people to the shores of this country, it could only be considered enlightened self-interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Walser.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have prepared a lengthy statement, which I will not read, but hopefully will be submitted for the record. I simply will try to sort of make a few comments from the remarks that I have here. So it may be just a bit rough, but I will spare you the reading of my testimony. I had the privilege of being a Foreign Service officer. I started in Managua, Nicaragua in 1980. I served as an extradition officer in Colombia in the mid-1980s. I was in Guadalajara shortly after the murder of Kiki Camarena. I have seen the dimensions of the drug problem. They just don't seem to go away. I have great sympathy and solidarity and concern for the security and well-being of our 40 million Central American neighbors. In fact, I'm married to a Nicaraguan, so therefore I have an extra reason to be concerned about Central America. I commend your efforts to call attention to Central America. At times it seems that it has sort of fallen off the radar screen, but the statistics that have been produced, the graphic evidence of the mounting problems, particularly in the northern triangle, are disturbing. I think that I would agree with my colleagues. I think we have to conceive of the approach to Central American security largely in two basic tracks. We have to think of, I totally agree with most everything that Kevin says, even about the burdens of adding additional fiscal resources, although I come from the Heritage Foundation and we're not real keen on raising taxes. However, there is a just milieu, as one might say. So the first part of that Central American security track is clearly getting the sorts of buy-in that we saw occur in Colombia. We have to have the elites buying in, we have to have citizens, we have to have leaders that are prepared to stand up and make the security situation not sort of a populist theme, not just mano duro or the hard hand as they talk about, but there certainly needs to be a concentration of leadership, a focus on these issues, a regional unity effort that is noticeable and something that we can track. We can't, here in the United States, we can't change the cultures. We couldn't, as Kevin pointed out and Cynthia pointed out, we couldn't make peace in Central America until Mr. Arias and others came along, until the Central Americans themselves began to buy in the peace process. So I think in the same way, we're going to have to see this sort of coming together. That is one element of the Central American security track, one that we can definitely not forget. We need to see Central American policy and opinion makers making a commitment to multi-year, multi-administration efforts. They must cease viewing law enforcement as a source of political patronage, and they have to get they have to get tough about fighting corruption, particularly among politicians in countries such as Guatemala, where local politics is very heavily infiltrated, but other countries as well. Finally, Central Americans we have to watch Central America, which continues to suffer from democratic backsliding and the emergence of populist-style leaders whose efforts to extend their grip on power come at great institutional cost. The cases of Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua certainly come to mind. Polarized nations with weakened democratic institutions and absent the rule of law only benefit the lawless. I think that we do see concern on the part of the Obama administration trying to move forward to integrate a consistent security, counter-drug, counter-crime policy. I noted, for example, that I think it was 2 years ago that Congressman Elliot Engel made an effort to develop a comprehensive strategy for the region. I understand recently that ONDCP, that Director Kurlikowski has said that his office is preparing a Western Hemisphere strategy, which will hopefully knit together those pieces that we have talked about today. We've reviewed clearly the importance of CARSI. My concern at this particular point is not only do we have CARSI, but we have something that the President spoke about in El Salvador, which is the Central American Citizen Security Partnership. The more you create these sorts of mechanisms, I think the more and especially if you have very limited resources, you sort of turn them in from sort of hard-hitting anti-drug, anti-crime efforts into sort of larger sort of foreign policy as social work efforts, developmental efforts. And I agree, again, we have to attack those sort of drivers of insecurity, unemployment, and the like. But the more you try to accomplish in your strategy, you sort of lose your focus, and we clearly have resource issues. I make a number of suggestions. Not too many of them are particularly original, but I called through much of the literature. A couple of things that I think that I agree with Kevin Caucus, the importance of things like CSIG, of sort of experimentation, hybrid institutions, things that break up the status quo are extremely important. I think that clearly the importance of vetted units, special ways of going after sort of high-profile criminals, criminal masterminds, and kingpins is still important. We need to create and monitor these institutions, learn from them, create what one of my colleagues calls sort of beacons of hope for future programs. In other words, we need a good assessment of what works in Central America. We should not forget the Central American militaries. They are still one of the most professional cadres. They are dedicated to their defense of their nations. Oftentimes, they are less corrupt than other institutions in Central America. So when looking at and discussing policy in the region, let's look at the ways in which we can interface with the Central American militaries. A couple of other points I would finally make. I think that we should target communities, particularly those hard hit by violence. I think this is an opportunity, for example, to use sort of social networkings, cell phones, alert systems. I know the Colombians, for example, I think they created tip lines, and they actually paid people off if they sort of, became informants. I think that you need to look at some other aspects of the Colombian example in the communities area. There's one sort of pet side which I will highlight here, is also we need to continue to do more here in the United States, not just about guns and other things, but about demand reduction. We have to realize, as most everyone has pointed out, that we have a great responsibility for what is going on. And one of the things I would like to see is actually the United States President Obama actually take sort of a lead role. As far as I can determine, I have not seen a sort of demand reduction or spot by the President, who obviously has great contact with the American people, to emphasize the importance and the dangers and the harm that drug consumption does here, not only to ourselves, but also to our neighbors abroad. The final note I would say is that the standing up of CARSI, the standing up the Central American Citizen Security Partnership, trying to do this with roughly $100 million per year just doesn't seem like it's an sufficient amount of money. I think we are going to have to be mindful of absorptive capacities, abilities of institutions to perform effectively, but simply sort of straightlining a figure, letting arbitrary sort of budget figures and a general plea of insolvency govern our security, I don't think is the way that we wish to go. With that, I think that we have invested over the last 3 decades, as Cynthia pointed out, a great deal of money, a great deal of our prestige and our leadership in Central America, and I think it is incumbent upon the United States to continue to play that leadership role in Central America that we have played in the past. Thank you.
Well, let me thank all of you. I think the testimony was really very, very good and very much appreciated. And, it seems to me that so much is necessary. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. But I was reading on page 7 of Mr. Casas Zamora's testimony. The first thing, scale up resources allocated to CARSI. The second, support Guatemala CSIG? I hate acronyms, and I'm not good at them.
The Impunity Commission. International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala.
All right. And because there you've got 2 entities. I mean, if there's a way of scaling it up, it seems to me if you really have major permeation of Zetas and Sinaloa, you're in for a very bad time. And I would combine that. I don't know whether they're asset seizures laws, what we would call RICO, racketeering statutes in Central America, like we have here, where you can really go in and seize assets of some of these gangs that are trafficking and killing.
There are, but they're usually very cumbersome, I believe. I think they don't apply. They take forever, is my remembrance from, I think, working in Costa Rica.
Is that right, Mr. Casas Zamora?
It's basically right. I mean, they tend to be, there are laws, but they tend to be very weak. Actually, one of the interesting and important steps that could be made in Central America is to adopt something that the Colombians did that proved very effective, which is basically what they call la extinción de dominio. Basically, that the authorities show up when there's a blatant display of wealth. The authorities can show up at your doorstep and ask you where the resources came from in order to purchase whatever is it that you're displaying. And the presumption of innocence shifts. The burden of the proof shifts. And if you can prove the legitimate origin of the resources used to purchase your assets, then the government can seize those assets. That's proved extraordinarily effective in Colombia. And that was actually an adaptation of something the Italians did in Sicily.
See, I think we have to look at a whole combination of things, both the kind of social improvement, the education improvement, all of it, but as well as the law enforcement. Because I think, and I think it's particularly true in these countries, once these cartels get a stranglehold, it's very tough to change it. Ms. Aronson?
Sure. Thank you. If I could just add.
Arnson, excuse me.
I think we have to be very careful about defining the problem. We have a problem in Central America now because there was a problem in Colombia that got better, and that there is now a frontal assault on the cartels in Mexico, and that has spread the activity into Central America. I think the balloon effect, which is usually described or used to describe the displacement of coca cultivation from one area to the other, is applicable across the chain of drug trafficking. So to the extent that we get better in Central America, it's going to go elsewhere, as long as the money remains in it and as long as the demand remains high. And so I think that there is much, much more that needs to be done in this country to effectively reduce demand, to identify the communities and the places around the country where drug demand is the highest, to be prepared to invest not only with the government but in partnership with the private sector in creating jobs and opportunities in those communities where those things don't exist.
Yeah,
I think that's the long
I
term.
happen to actually agree with you. I followed Mrs. Reagan's Just Say No, and I kind of, in the beginning, thought, oh, this isn't going to work. But it did. It did work. And I think just some very high-level concentration on young people. Right now, it isn't there. And consequently, what's happened is we now see drugs flavored with candy, all kinds of things to induce youngsters to buy candy-coated marijuana and other kinds of drugs. It's just terrible. So I got to put my thinking cap on, and hopefully with your help and the help of anybody that wants to help, really come up with something. I think Mrs. Obama has done a wonderful thing with keeping people fit, eating right. But I'll tell you, I wish she would go into this area with a program really devised to hit demand as hard as possible.
Sure.
I mean, we have all kinds of things, you know, incentive programs, drug courts, all of it. I've been, as a mayor, I've seen it up close and personal. So I'm not quite as sociologically intended as you might be, because I believe, to a great extent, in the organizational part of it, you're really dealing with major criminals. And it's not one thing, it's going to be another. And, you know, they kill with abandon. So I think that you can't just let it. The balloon effect, candidly, doesn't bother me. The fact is, Colombia made a difference. They did the right thing. They were able to stop this enormous penetration to a great extent. And you've got it working in Mexico now. And, you know, President Calderon's term is coming to an end. I hope that the effort he's made isn't coming to an end. And he's been incredibly brave. But now with the spread into Central America, it becomes an enormous cesspool unless you do attack it, I think. So I'd like to, you know, put on our thinking cap and see what we might be able to come up with, and ask you for your continued input on specifics. You know, how do we scale up resources? What kind of an in-kind share? Because I think you're right. You have to get the countries have to put something up too. I mean, we're a foreign country. It ought to be a coalition.
If you allow me, Senator, I think that's a crucial idea in this. I mean, unless the countries step up to the plate, this won't be solved, because the drivers of this are ultimately very structural. I mean, it is only the Central American countries that can rebuild their law enforcement institutions, to different degrees in different countries, to be sure, because Costa Rica is not the same as Guatemala. But those tasks can only be done by the Central Americans themselves, not to speak of the fact that the creation of opportunities for young people in Central America cannot be done by the U.S.
No, that's true.
And finally, one of the crucial points in all this is that organized crime thrives in ungoverned areas. So it is not entirely surprising that Guatemala is having the problems it's having, given the fact that the Guatemalan state collected 10% of GDP in taxes in 2010. A state that collects 10% of taxes, 10% of GDP in taxes, is a state that doesn't go beyond the cities. So it is not surprising that 40% of the Guatemalan territory is, for all practical purposes, outside the effective control of the state. So the tax issue is crucial in this whole discussion.
Well, let me thank you. I have to move on, unfortunately, too. But think about this and work with our staffs, and let's see if we can come up with something on a bipartisan basis that would be helpful. Because you've got some good organizations. They need to be built upon. I like the idea of a matching program. We might even be able to raise something in the private sector as well. You say any United States strategy against organized crime in Central America should simulate cooperation efforts from the two crucial actors in ways that are complementary to the United States' own programs. And I think that's right. I mean, I don't know any of the leadership, the current leadership in Central America, the electeds. But let me, you were an elected. Let me ask you a question. How willing are they to go out on a limb, as Calderon has done in Mexico? Very, not very, or not at all?
In some cases, their political survival might depend on it, because this is by far the biggest issue in Central America. You know, the population is genuinely anguished by this. So I don't think that they can simply run, you know, and hide. They have to take on this.
Have any of them tried?
To different degrees, and they are doing so in different ways. Mind you, they haven't dealt with the most structural issue, which is the tax issue. I mean, their political systems have proven totally impermeable to any kind of tax reform. So to that extent, they have not stepped up to the plate, but they are trying to revamp their law enforcement institutions in different ways and to different degrees.
Go ahead, Ms. Arneson.
Sure, if I could add that there's, I think, a broad range of institutional capacity in Central America among the different countries, but there are people and leaders that are trying to make a big difference. And I think that it's especially important to identify those areas where the governments themselves are trying to move forward and support them in every way that we can.
Who is trying to make a big difference?
I think President Funes in El Salvador has done some very significant things, including purging members of the National Civilian Police Force in a massive way. There has been much greater emphasis on social investment to counteract gang activity, and I think that, you know, there is a good faith effort. There are many things to be critical of in Nicaragua in terms of the state of democratic governance and the violations of the democratic process, but I think that the Nicaraguan government has been more effective than some of the others in fighting trafficking and in fighting youth gangs. I think there's a great desire on the part of many governments, but as has been said repeatedly, a lack of capacity. But I would agree that it's really shameful that in a country like Nicaragua, in order to increase social spending to address the deep poverty that exists in the country, they take away money from the law enforcement and judicial reform budget. That is simply not acceptable, and the United States and other donors should require that the fiscal situation throughout the region changes.
Well, let me ask for your help. I think, we've done a report on Afghanistan. We've got the Mexico report. I think next one ought to be Central America. This is actually the Caucus on International Drug Control. So I think we ought to try to see if we can't put together the nucleus of a program which could bring the countries together. Every country there could participate. We could provide some feedstock in various ways into this. Would you all be willing? Because obviously, from your different perspectives, you're all wonderful, I think. And we need the help. How about it?
Counting it.
Okay? Okay?
Absolutely.
Okay?
Happy to help.
All right. Well, then the staff will be in contact with you, if that's all right, and we'll sit down and see what we might be able to put together that's real and practical, and that we can somehow, some way help with the funding, which is the toughest part of it right now because of where we are. But I think the point is that left to its own devices, absent this, you're going to have a completely lawless Central America, which is also going to affect both Mexico and the United States. So, thank you very much. And the hearing's adjourned.